So when I was asked to do this panel, I was quite excited because I thought this is the opportunity to have a very forward-looking discussion in a world without the diversity project, because we'd resolved everything. However, as the conference grew closer, I started to panic because I didn't have a crystal ball and I didn't know whether we could achieve that in the next 5 or 10 years. So this discussion is going to be a kind of, the next 30 minutes looking at the future of the workplace and what things may or may not happen to help us progress our equality, diversity and inclusion discussion. So in preparation for this, in the absence of this crystal ball, I found a PwC report titled Workforce of the Future, Competing Forces Shaping 2030. And they identified 5 areas that might actually shape our working future. So the firstly was technology breakthroughs, so kind of rapid advances that were going to change the way that we work, technology innovations. Demographic shifts. We all know that we have an aging society and the impact that would have on our workplace. Rapid urbanization on a global scale of kind of people migrating to where the work is. Shifts in global economic power as we kind of move from developing countries having more economic strength than developed countries. And then finally, resource scarcity, so depletion of fossil fuels, extreme weather, etc. So great piece of work from PwC. I don't think it told me anything. So we're going to have a poll now to see whether you know the answers. Is there a poll? Please answer the poll, because it will help us immensely. So seriously, in thinking about the conversation today, I've actually looked more closely to home, and I found a piece of research by Marissa Hall, co-head of the Think Tank Institute and Diversity Project member. And she did a piece of work around some of the themes that were going to shape the future of work. And there's a couple of her themes that I want to focus on with this discussion today. So the first thing that she identified was the hybrid working journey remains messy. She said it's clear that the future of work is hybrid. In a CFA Institute survey on the future of work, 81% of investment professionals stated they'd like to spend more time working remotely, with employers having to rapidly adapt to this demand through flexible working practices. So this is what Marissa thinks. So, Annie, to start with, is hybrid working here to stay?
I'd say flexible working is here to stay. Hybrid might work for some organisations, it might not work for others. And I think that's the key, really, is that just like clothing, one size fits nobody. Every organisation has got to really work out what is the way that they're going to get their people to work together that's best going to be able to them to deliver on their purpose and their strategy while acknowledging the skills and capabilities of their organisation. And it is messy, and the only way you're going to find out what works for you is by experimenting. Not just try out new things, get feedback from your employees, co-create it with them, take into account that employees at different stages of their lifetimes will require different things from work. That's the way that you're going to be able to work out what you need. But there are challenges in this. It's quite interesting. I talk to a lot of CEOs in my coaching work, and I think a lot of them actually would much prefer people to be in the workplace and not working remotely or partly in the office. And yet, as you've said, 75–85% of people want to continue this flexible way of working. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. I think the other thing, too, is we are getting evidence of proximity bias creeping in. And by that, I mean that we tend to be more favourably disposed towards those people who we see regularly and we hang out with regularly. And that's really going to undermine fairness and equity if we're not careful when we've got some people working in the office, some people not. And there's evidence that this is creeping in from some work that Gartner Consultancy had done, where they did a survey of line managers across a range of different industries. But 63% of these line managers, their perception was that people who worked in the office were more productive than those who worked at home. And they also said, which I thought was really disappointing, 76% of them said that they were more likely to promote somebody who spent more time in the office than working from home. And that really is quite worrying. So we've got to be careful of some of these challenges. There are, however, opportunities. There's been some fantastic work done by some Harvard professors called Doshi and McGregor. And they've looked into what really drives employee engagement. And the number one driver is people having some autonomy over how their work gets done. So, you know, yes, have the goals, have the objectives, but give someone the autonomy about how and where they get that work done, and some input into role design. And employee engagement and motivation, you know, really does go skyrocketing. So this provides a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to create these kind of places. But as I say, it has to be bespoke. We'd all wish that there was a blueprint or a magic silver bullet, but there really isn't. And so experimenting, trying out different things, getting feedback, doing focus groups, just don't rely on your once a year annual employee survey. That's the way that you're going to have to be able to figure this out. But flexible working, undoubtedly here to stay.
Fantastic. So one of the issues I face, you know, in my own organisation, I moved everyone to 3-2 working contracts and empowered managers to kind of manage their teams on which days they were going to be in, and waited for the return to the office, and it kind of didn't happen as expected. I had busy days and I had quiet days, and the only day I can guarantee a full office is if there's pizzas.
Well, my challenge to you is we've got to make office magnets, not mandates.
Yeah.
So mandating that someone's got to be in the office doesn't work. You've got to provide a really compelling reason as to why people need to be there. You know, there's got to be purposefulness and intentionality in why people need to be there. Why am I going to come into the office just to do a Zoom call? And there was an article in today's FT saying that actually in financial services, an awful lot of people are not coming into the office on the so-called mandatory days because they can't see any reason for doing so. So I think that's one of the key things. Make our offices, as I say, magnets, not mandates.
Yeah. So I think
pizza might be the way.
Yeah, maybe. But this, as a business head, this now creates a problem for my real estate because I've got busy days and quiet days. So Soondra, what do you think this means for the workplace and what the current office should look like? You know, what should offices look like in the future? What does it mean for our infrastructure in the city with all these wonderful offices that we've got that are empty on a Friday?
Well, I noticed that today in City AM, who are consistently talking up the prospects for commercial property, that they said that London commercial property unfazed by hybrid working, which I thought was a very brave thing to say, given that if you look in the city on a Friday, it's 13% occupancy according to Free Space. Mondays, 25% occupancy, and it's peaking at 42% in between Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So we're in a radically different office infrastructure environment. Just put a bit of context around my business, and I was really inspired by some of the previous speakers and stuff you're doing. We're a corporate finance and financial planning business, and typically we're acquiring small businesses which are really very old-fashioned in the way that they're structured, in the way that their infrastructure works, in the way that their people are work. It's generally male, old 60-year-old male, white male-led, with women in the back office. That's a very typical structure for a lot of small financial planning businesses, and we're trying to modernise them. And so this stuff about diversity isn't, for us, we see this as not. Look, I'm trying to increase shareholder value. I'm pretty brutalistic about this, but we're doing it for a reason. But actually, this is part of it. To modernise the businesses, we're modernising their tech infrastructure. We're modernising their proposition that they're making to their clients. We're modernising their way of working, but we're also modernising the way that they're organising teams, the way they're working together, but also this office infrastructure stuff as well. The simple truth is, I don't know is what we need. It's got to be the case that if you've got 13% occupancy on a Friday, that's kind of telling you something that the 2015 version of the office is long gone. We can have an infinity number of City AM articles headlining that hybrid working doesn't phase the city. The truth is, it probably does and should do. We are going to have to change the way that we set up offices. I don't know what the right approach is. I think it's something like a combination of, I think you hit the nail on the head. We've got to make offices attractive places to come to for certain days of the week. We've got to make the events happen at the office. We've got to make it exciting. We've got to make sure that we allow people to work sometimes at home, sometimes in the office, and that there is a way of bringing people through and forward in organisations where they don't work as much in the office as in other as their colleagues in other parts of the organisation. It's a very difficult thing to do. God knows how governments are going to plan for what infrastructure is necessary at a gross level in the economy, but at a micro level, I mean, there's some very simple things we're planning on is we're pretty much planning to have about 60% of the office footprint per person going forward as we have going into the pandemic. And so that's expanding and not expanding the footprint of our office space. It's changing the nature of the offices so that people have got less dedicated, there's nothing magical about this, less dedicated space. I know that a lot of organisations are looking at campuses with other businesses, other kinds of way of maximising that hub feature of working, and that's got to be a part of it as well. The simple truth is, until we actually know what going forward it's going to look like in the wider world, and God knows it looks different today than it did a year ago, than it did a year before that, and a year before that. I don't think we can plan perfectly, but there's some pretty good clues out there. People like meeting each other. People like being in the office. If everybody is at home all of the time, then it does fall to certain parts of the of our employee communities not to get promoted, and that's something we've all got to deal with. So if you're going to have a modern forward-facing organisation, you've actually got to get people back into the office, whether it's with pizzas or it's been orders or it's with something, because there is a need to have organisations that have people speaking to people. Equally, I don't think that we're ever going to go back to the time when anybody's working 5 days a week. I mean, God, I went through 30 years of commuting 5 days a week. I can't even begin to imagine doing it anymore.
Thanks, Soondra. So, still messy then. So, Nicky, what can government do to support this transition from this messy world we're in now to where we have a nice, tidy, structured world in the future?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. I mean, I think the truth is we're not going to end up in a sort of a non-messy world, because this is clearly an evolution which poses quite a lot of problems, actually, for government. And in many ways, of course, government's been quite distracted the last couple of years. So actually what we've seen is this extraordinary shift to hybrid working. But I take Annie's point about we ought to talk about flexible working, because I think the next generation who are coming through, frankly, it's almost taken for granted that they can work wherever they want. The question is, they don't want to work full time. And they don't want to do 30 years of commuting, and I've done my fair share of that as well into the city. So actually some of the points that Soondra was talking about, I think for government it's going to be challenging, things like planning, actually use of building space in cities, but also if you've got a number of people now working, you know, I represented a constituency, a market town in the Midlands, where actually you're going to have probably more people working close to there during the week, and they're going to be using the services during the week. So things you've taken for granted about people movement, transport, car parking, all of that has changed. Other cities where they rely perhaps on a workplace parking premium, where you're going to charge people for driving into that city, suddenly in the local authority you're going to have a hole in their finances, because actually they're going to have fewer people commuting in, and therefore they're not going to be able to charge and expect the income that they did. Station car parks, you know, meant to be a great barometer of the financial health of the nation. Now, you know, if you're going to be building new transport infrastructure and you know, modal interlinks, actually planning all that and the way that people use transport is going to be very, very different. But the challenge for government is going to be that it's going to take time. And actually, how do you, and at what point do you start to change government policy to reflect this new normal. And I hate that phrase because it is going to be what it's going to be. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge for ministers. The last time I think I sat here, I was Minister for Women and Equalities, and we were launching the usual annual report about the number of women in senior positions and in the boardroom and everything else. But the whole way of working, as we've seen, has changed. I think flexible working is good news for people who don't want to do things in the way that it's always been done. But just the simple making of policy of representation at certain levels of organisations, and don't forget government's got this challenge as well in terms of the civil service. All of those things, how you calculate, how the ONS calculates numbers for public policy making. Annie was talking about, and actually both have talked about, what's going to happen if people are being biased against because they're working out of the office and they're not getting the promotions. Well, it won't be long before people are calling for government to pass legislation to outlaw that or to make that clear that shouldn't be happening. Is that the place of government to do that? I'm not sure I know the answer, but the government will have to come up with a response, even if it's to say it's not for us to outlaw that sort of thing, but actually it's over to the business organisations to start working out how they handle that. Employee contracts, what does the law say about where people should work and what the expectations are. So fascinating. I think that the truth is that the government probably view now and in future will be, we're going to take our lead from business on all of this. We're going to take our lead from employers. We're going to see what's happened. And we're probably not going to rush policy making on this because there's plenty of other things to do.
Okay, still messy.
Still messy.
So on a positive note, about 6 months before COVID, I became the executive sponsor of the Smart Working Stream. And now, 2.5 years on, we've got it nailed. So,
but you just share it with everyone else.
Which is actually not true. I think we are still in this state of flux, and the conversation within the Smart Working work stream is, firstly, how do we lock this down so we're not having a debate about are we all going back to the office full time again? And we've got to move on from that discussion. But now it's about supporting businesses, as you say, in kind of getting the right infrastructure and the right business cultures in place to kind of make this work. Any other observations from an ED&I perspective, Annie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole hybrid flexible working can both enhance the DE&I policy and approaches, but can also be a danger too. So going back to the proximity point earlier, I think that's one of the things that we have to be really careful about, is that we maintain the fairness and equity in DE&I, and that's going to be much harder when you have got people working in different ways. Particularly if you've got a very sort of male-dominated business, but you've got women with kids who want to spend more time working from home. We've got to absolutely make sure that they're not being left out when it comes to promotions and recognition and learning and development opportunities. So that to me is the biggest risk. But by contrast, though, I think it can be a tool that can really help you with DE&I. Again, there's been some interesting research done by McKinsey which shows that those who are traditionally underrepresented disproportionately prefer a hybrid way of working. And I think one of the reasons is that some employees do feel the need to hide maybe a disability or a gender identity or sexual orientation because they feel there's a stigma or that they're not going to be accepted for who they are. And that covering does take actually a huge amount from their mental well-being and their ability to be truly productive. And by having some time where they can also work at home and really be themselves, it enables them to manage that in a much more effective way. And so I think having a more bespoke approach to how people get their work done can really help that, and that's the real opportunity here. And I just wanted to give you a few stats because I found these really interesting. But in this McKinsey research, they also looked at how more likely some of these underrepresented groups were likely to leave an organisation if flexible working was taken away from them. And so, for example, women are 10% more likely to leave if they don't have the opportunity for flexible working than men. Employees with disabilities, 14% more likely to leave. LGBTQ plus, 24% more likely to leave if they don't have that opportunity. And for black employees, 14% more likely than their white peers. So, you know, those firms like Goldman, where David Solomon says he thinks that hybrid flexible working is an aberration, well, I'm afraid I think he's got it really wrong, because I think it's very much going to affect their diversity, and it's that diversity that's going to enable organisations like Goldman Sachs to thrive. So it's something we say, there are opportunities, but there are also challenges.
Okay, thank you. We best move on from hybrid working, otherwise you'll think I'm being paid by the smart working workstream. So the second point that Marissa raised in her research was the rise of the human-centric organisation. She states that we're now working in an era of human-focused company culture where workers are re-evaluating what matters most to them. This has prompted employers to focus on well-being and personal satisfaction of employees through increasing flexibility, investing in wellness programs, and boosting diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts. So, Nicky, what's your take on this? Is this something that you're seeing across the wider financial services industry?
Yes, I think it is, and I think it depends much on the age of the talent that you're trying to bring in. I do think so. One of the other roles I hold, I'm just about to take over from Christine Hodgson's chair of something called the Careers and Enterprise Company, which works to build bridges between the world of work and employers and the world of education. And I think that they would say that young people these days are looking to join organisations with a real purpose, somewhere that they can believe in. Of course, they're not looking, as I said before, to work full-time necessarily in that one organisation. They might well have a business or an entrepreneurial element to their life on the side, and then they'll be working for an organisation. I mean, I certainly, since I left politics and joined various boards, there's much more conversation about culture now than I would ever have expected. Partly, of course, because of the pandemic, and I think that employers are having to be involved in their employees' health and well-being much more than they perhaps might have expected or might have felt comfortable doing. I think there's a much bigger, broader, better conversation about mental health now than there ever has been. Although I think those stats that Annie has just mentioned are fascinating, because it also says to me what's wrong with those workplaces that people feel that the only way they can be comfortable is not to turn up. And I think, in an era of competing for talent, businesses and actually all organisations, I shouldn't just talk about business, because, of course, the other thing that struck me, Stephen, I was listening to that about well-being, is there are many organisations, particularly I think people say in public sector, where they are massively under pressure, where actually I'm sure employers do talk about well-being, but many people don't see it at the front line. So actually, the long hours culture, I think we have an issue, don't we, about there's 600,000 people now missing from the workplace post-pandemic. Some of them, it may be long health. I think some of them have just looked at the culture of the place they were working and thought, I don't want to go back. And so I think, again, there's a broader conversation about how do organisations really think about what it is that is putting off their talent, why are they losing people and the turnover, and what they need to do in order to try to put that right. And I do think well-being is at the heart of that conversation.
Yeah. So when I read that, and I knew we were talking about it, Soondra, your background is obviously investment banking and kind of M&A, and I kind of thought the human-centric organisation doesn't really sound investment banking to me. So will they change? Well, and who are the winners and losers in all of this? Is it just people are going to move from one industry to another?
So I think that one of the things you've got to be cognizant of in the investment banking in general, in the finance industry in general, is that it's a high turnover industry. It's always been a high turnover industry, and one of the reasons for that high turnover, different parts of investment banking, different parts of the city have different levels of turnover. But there's some very hard work parts of finance where you get 22-year-olds coming in and 24-year-olds coming out because they don't like the culture, and that's always been the case. We've got a very unusual set of circumstances right now in terms of any employer going out there into the market and trying to employ people. You've got this crunch, partly because of Brexit, of not being able to hire clever Italians and French graduates. You've got a whole cohort of young people coming onto the market now who've had their entire university and early careers disturbed by 3 years of sitting at home, or who hasn't seen colleagues sitting inside their bedroom on on a Zoom call with all their worldly possessions on top of their cupboard. Not like, you know, kind of the person sitting at, the 50-year-old sitting at in their nice Surrey mansion having a nice time of it. So it's a very different set of experience that those people have had. So I think whatever the industry, in the end, I think there has been a change, and I do agree with you, Annie. I think that, you know, that I spoke to the CEO of another investment business, investment bank, and who made a very strong case that he had absolutely moved to 5 days a week working in his organisation. It was mandatory, and I'd gone to a meeting at his office, and 3 of the people out of the 12 in that meeting had dialed in by Zoom, and that is how mandatory he had made it, and he'd completely failed. Obviously completely failed because we're in a new world, and you can't mandate this stuff. So it doesn't matter what industry you're in, this reality has hit us. We've got a new cohort of people. They're expecting something different. We have a different world, and as you said, 500,000 people have left the workforce. I don't think whether it's in insurance, whether it's in asset management, whether it's in investment banking, stockbroking, whichever sector of finance, there is a new world hitting us. I think whether or not CEOs are saying it or not, there is an acceptance that this is the way that it's going to be, and we need to flex around our workforce, whether it's calling it well-being or it's just tacitly accepting reality. I think that we will look in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time at this, and it's a major changing. It's a fundamental change in the dynamic of work. You know, like the telegram coming in, like the internet coming in, and it's going to change everything.
Okay. So final question, Annie. The human-centric culture. What does that mean from an HR perspective in practical terms? You know, are we just a few workshops around well-being, or?
No. Well, the first thing I would do is I would not call yourselves HR, human resources. People don't see themselves as human resources. They're human beings. And in my previous role, which actually wasn't at UBS, my last role was actually as group head of HR at UniCredit. And the first thing I did when I took on that role was to change my title to group head of people and culture. And it wasn't virtual signalling. It was because I was absolutely intending that people should be at the heart of the systems and processes that we had to manage the talent in that organisation. And that was my way of establishing right from the get-go that that's what our ambition was going to be. Secondly, I think that, you know, what HR really needs to do is to support some of the things that we just talked about. To me, there are 5 clear things. One is that organisations do have to have a purpose. And interestingly, Harvard Business School have also done some research that showed that people are willing to trade a percentage of their lifetime earnings in order to have more meaning in what they do. And it's also then connecting what that person does on a day-to-day basis, aligning that line of sight with what the overall purpose of the strategy of the organisation is. That's so important to do. The second thing is this sense of belonging, and this sense of belonging has become a lot harder now. We've got people working remotely and in the office. People want to feel that they're still connected, they're part of a team, and when you haven't got that physical proximity or connection, we have to find emotional ways of creating that, even if it is sometime virtually. So how do we find ways of doing that? I think the third thing is learning and development. You know, people want to feel that they're being invested in. And learning and development really fell off a cliff during the pandemic, and that's got to be put right back at the top of the agenda again for people. The fourth thing is well-being, which we've already talked about. And then I'd say the last thing again is this giving some people some autonomy over how their work gets done. That will really make a big difference. And I promise you that if you can get all of those 5 things in place, you really will get more engaged and motivated employees, and that will have a direct impact on your bottom line. I think the biggest challenge facing people who work in human resources, and we'll call it that for now, is that I think senior leaders and line managers don't necessarily have the right skills and development to be able to do this. And so there's got to be much more emphasis put on that. You have to have people who are much more compassionate in the way that they lead and manage their teams. They have to take an interest in the lives of the people that they're working with, not just what they do in their work. They also have to get comfortable with leading and managing with uncertainty and ambiguity. And for some people, that's very hard. A lot of our leaders and line managers have got to where they've got to because, you know, they have the answers, that they're the one that's always right. And suddenly they've got to admit that they don't know all the answers. There's a humility here of saying, I don't know, but together we'll figure this out. That, again, doesn't come naturally to a lot of these people, and we have to really help them develop the skills to be able to do that. And then my last point would be this thing that you both talked about, this fundamental change. Professor Linda Grattan's written a fabulous book called 100-Year Life. And what she talks about is the fact that, you know, we need to be thinking even further ahead. This old setup where we have education, work and retirement is really dissipating. And we're going to be in a world where people will do some education and training, and then maybe they'll work for a bit, and then maybe they'll take a sabbatical, and then come back to work but want to do something else and reskill, and then maybe they'll want to volunteer and do something else. It's going to be a much more fluid way of working, and organisations have really got to think about, well, what does that mean in terms of who do we hire, when do we hire, and what kind of skills do we need from these people?
Okay, thank you. I should have been taking notes on all of that. So I want to thank the panel. So thank you, Annie. Thank you, Soondra. Thank you, Nicky. I've been asked to give a call to action at the end of this this session, and unashamedly, I'm going to focus on hybrid working and smart working. So I would call the call to action for everyone within their businesses is to put smart working, hybrid working at the heart of their business strategy. It is intersectional across all areas of diversity and inclusion and is the cornerstone for what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.